So we're going to get started.
Teacher and me.
I hope everyone's here for the clinical teaching seminar series. Not in room 130, but in here. Everyone's here for that, right? We're going to talk about qualitative survey analysis. Yeah, all right. Who was super excited when they walked into the room and it was totally full? I walked in half an hour, I was like, wow, everyone was really excited to see me talk. But no, they weren't. They really weren't. My name is Sylvia Barecki-Merrill. I'm a research scholar in the Department of Surgery with Aspire, which is a health services research unit. And I am here to talk with you about how to analyze your qualitative data that you might have collected via surveys or other forms. We can be flexible. Just to start off with, I forgot my clicker. Who here has worked with qualitative data before? Yeah, a smattering, if you will. Who wants to work with qualitative data for their honor scholar projects? Yes. A little bit more people. That's great. Who's just sort of interested and is just like, I don't know ever what to do with the data that I'm collecting. Yeah, we've all been there, right? Collect so much data, we don't know what to do with it. It's like data overload. All right, well, today we'll be talking about how do you start thinking about the analytic process itself when you've collected the data. We're going to have some conversations about common analytic approaches, and this might be something that we might talk about and we can talk about in the future, and we might have to go back and forth about it. And don't worry, and just ask questions along the way. We're going to compare and contrast thematic and content analysis, which are some different ways to present the data that you can be collecting. And then we'll have a short exercise if we have time, and that's part of the handouts in the back. One of the 2 pages is a worksheet, and one of the 2 pages is really an information sheet. So does everybody have their handouts? Who's missing a handout? All right, everyone's handouts. That's great. A lot of the content that we'll be talking about today, the main gist of the content is on one of those worksheets. So feel free to take it with you, take it home, and refer to it. There's references. All right. So as part of the clinical teaching seminar series, these are some general basic research design questions that we'll be going over during the series. And I believe so far we've gone over research questions and how to collect survey data. That's correct. All right. And today we're going to go over how to do the qualitative survey data analysis and a little bit on how to display some of that data to sort of give you a sense on what you can do with qualitative data, either in a quantitative presentation or in a qualitative presentation. And then later on in the series, you'll be going over some other research design methods. Just keeping in mind that each of these things actually are interrelated. So when we'll be talking about content or thematic analysis, it's important for you to know how you collected the data, but also what your research question is. And that will help guide you through the process, but also help guide you also to your conclusions, any sort of data interpretations that you might have. All right, so for those of you who have raised your hands in terms of that you've had experience with collecting qualitative survey data, what are some ways that you're collecting that data and why are you collecting it? I'm going to call some people out. Yes?
I'm trying to teach wound care for the medical students in their surgery courses, and so I made a survey. I missed the last talk, so but I have some data, and I'm just unsure how to use it.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out best ways to teach wound care.
So it's a needs assessment survey, and you ask questions like, what are some things that you're missing in your current curriculum? Like, what else did you ask?
Well, I tried to figure out what their knowledge was first, and then if this was beneficial, and if this was something that they would fill gaps in their knowledge.
Okay. So when we're going to be talking about the rest of the session, just start thinking through how the different types of approaches might help you design a curriculum in the future, or go back to leadership and saying we need more funds, right, to design a different type of curriculum in the future. Anybody else? What are some ways that you're using open-ended survey questions in your surveys? This side over here. No one has designed an open-ended survey question. Yeah.
My project is to create like a peer learning between the students.
Great.
So basically my starting point is figuring out what people want to learn.
That's great.
What do you want to learn?
Oh, what a great question. How often you ask, what do you want to learn from your professional colleagues that you don't really learn together with, right? So that's wonderful. These are some great projects that I'd like to maybe have you guys sort of shout out some questions you have, especially that we'll be going through the analytic processes, all right? So some benefits of analyzing open-ended survey questions is that they're basically structured and everybody gets to answer it, okay? So there's some challenges with qualitative data collection. If you're having different styles of data collection, you may have heard of interviews, focus groups, surveys are one way to collect qualitative data. But the real strength and benefits of surveys is that everybody gets asked the same question the same way in the same order, usually, okay? And so it's a great way to have a structured response, and you can sort of think through the different mechanisms and how you could analyze that data. So you know in advance what the parameters might be if you're giving a very limited open-ended question, which does sound counterintuitive. There's also a finite number of responses and respondents because you know how many people that you are sending the survey out to, so you have a maximum number that you are going to be analyzing. Basically, most of the time, we're actually asking people to fill these out digitally. So you have the benefit of not having to transcribe the information, which might be a challenge when you have an interview or focus group, right? So there's lots of benefits in terms of collecting the information in this way. But now that you've collected it, you need a systematic way of coding this information and analyze the responses. And you yourself as the researcher may be the subjective person doing that, all right? So when we're collecting these open-ended survey responses, how do you normally analyze the data? So in the past, I've heard participants say, we put them away in a filing cabinet. How does that sound familiar? Who's done that? I've done that, right? Like there's so much data that we're collecting. So it's really easy to say, oh, I collected this data. I'll think about it another time and I'm moving on to something else, et cetera. And then, years go by and you're like, oh, I see that data now, right? So it's sort of like interesting to think about like, let's, shake off those papers if, literal or figurative and figure out what to do with them, right? So when we're going to be approaching the data that you're collecting through surveys, there's different ways to analytically approach that, okay? And one caveat I want to start with is that in qualitative data, there's no real established or standardized protocol for the analytic process, okay? It's really challenging sometimes, especially for those of us who've been trained in a more like RCT or EPI type of background, like to have a little bit more of an open-ended approach to the analytic process. We sort of have to retrain ourselves when we're looking at qualitative data because there's no established way to do it. It's definitely a fluid process. It depends on your research question. The research question really helps guide on how you analyze that data, and we can talk about that a little bit more specifically later, but it really gives us an opportunity to think outside of the box when we're looking at the data that we're trying to analyze. And then under certain circumstances, you might even want to modify some of the approaches that you're taking or design new survey questions or new analytic or data collection approaches because of the data that you're uncovering, right? So that's pretty exciting. So there's multiple methods of this inquiry, and we're going to talk about specifically on the analytic process. There's a deductive approach, an inductive approach, and then sort of like a combined effort, which most of us end up doing. So we're thinking about the analytic processes. If you have a set of data in front of you, very often we start analyzing data in a deductive way. And that means that we're starting from the theory or something that's known out there in the literature, and we're going to use that idea that's already out there in literature and apply that framework in a coding mechanism, usually to the data that we've collected, right? So we're going from something really general that's out there in the world to specifically your own data set, okay? And what that looks like is that you come to your data that you've collected that's been sitting in the filing cabinet, And you already have a code book that's developed, or you design a code book that's based on some sort of theory that's already out there, right? And so the definitions and these ideas and the things that you're capturing are not coming from the data itself, but they're coming from this idea of this like theory or conceptual framework that's been predetermined, okay? And you apply that to your data set. So what does this look like in real life? So one of the research questions that we've addressed in the past are, and this is something you'll see throughout the lecture, how do students define mistreatment during their clerkships? Okay? If we're going to do a deductive approach to that, I would develop a code book that's based on the ACGME definition of mistreatment. There's very specific categories that they have it. They have a very specific definition for it. Why should I redefine it, right? I might want to say, I just want to see, how students are doing it. How close is the ACGME definition to my own students? And I want to see potentially how many times each of these categories that the ACGME has thought of come up with my students. Okay, that's one way to apply this. If we're saying that we're going to be using something that's already out there in the world and applying it to our data set as we move forward, this is the deductive approach. Okay? And then we have an inductive approach where we basically start de novo, okay? We use our own data sets. We don't incorporate the outside world and outside ideas in terms of the code book development process. And we start with our own data and we inductively develop the code book and see what our students are saying about the topic at hand, in this case, mistreatment. And that's how we develop the code book over the length of the study. And we might want to see how that applies to the real world. Okay? So more concretely, you start with your data to identify any emergent ideas or codes that come up. And then you might see how that fits into the literature and you modify that according to theory. So in some instances, this is often mistaken as a constant comparative method, which is really only used during the grounded theory analytic approach. That is a different system than what most of us here are doing. Grounded theory tends to be more of a cyclical data collection and analytic process that's paired over time. But a lot of the work that we end up doing tends to be data collection first, analysis next, and that would not be a grounded theory approach generally, okay? So when you see in the literature someone saying, this is modified grounded theory approach, that's not technically correct. I've done it. This is something that's like, people say and do. I'm just letting you know that you're now consumers of qualitative literature, and if you see some things out there, you'll know a little more about it. Okay, so we go back to our original research question, how do students define mistreatment during clerkships? And then the inductive approach, what you would do is you would develop your own code book based on the statements that the students make, right? You might see something that's out there and you're looking at ways the students are defining it, and this really being developed by your own participants and your own students. And you might say, how does this compare to the ACGME definitions that's out there? Okay, and why would you want to do something like this? What do you think the benefits are of looking at an inductive approach, starting with just what your participants are saying? Yeah. Exactly. She is a plant. Yeah, you might want to expand on the ACGME definitions is what she said, right? So you might say, you know what, the ACGME definitions are good, but what if they're not good enough, right? Like what if our students are thinking that mistreatment is more than that, and that's not okay with the rest of us, right? We want to know what else students are experiencing and why and how we can maybe address that through some programming efforts, okay? So again, you start with your data and you identify these emergent codes. I think I have the animations off, right? Here's the thing. We don't always start with one thing and leave it at that, right? We might have a combined approach to this. And so you might start with an a priori theory or framework, maybe use that as a guiding system and mechanism when you're developing your code book. And then as you read through the rest of your responses, you might say, I'm seeing new things. And then you add in those new codes and new ideas, and that is okay, okay? You might also start off the process in an inductive manner, start off, adding these new codes and ideas as they emerge, and you might say to yourself, this really sounds like something else I've seen out there in the world, a recent piece of literature that just got published. Let me see how I can harness those ideas and add more value to my project, and then you would sort of incorporate those ideas and definitions, and that would be a combined approach as well. Any questions so far on this? All right. So we're thinking about approaching the analysis process itself. There's some things to consider. You really need to you think about how to balance this idea on how the survey was collected, what your research question is, and how you want to present that information in the most meaningful way to you, to your program, to a reviewer, to the world, right? It's a research study potentially. And this is really hard to do, okay? So when we're thinking about these analytic approaches, these are two of the main ways that we can do that. We can do a thematic analysis, which is what I see most often in the literature that I read. And you can also do a content analysis, okay? Which I also see in the literature. I'm not sure why I made that statement. But in a thematic analysis is a way where you basically reorganize the data into new patterns and themes, and you present those ideas as these thematic statements that is representative of some portion of your population that you're presenting data on. Content analysis is a more systematic objective measure where you're basically quantifying the qualitative, right? And we'll go through some examples of both. Now, again, as with the inductive and deductive approaches, you can do a combination of a thematic and content analysis. I'm not going to be up here telling you that you have to do one or the other, or one is far superior than another. Both of these have value. There's reasons one may want to do one over the other, and during certain circumstances, that might completely change in the next phase of your study or a new study as well. So when you're doing thematic analysis, this is just a comparison of the two. The real point is that the aim and the goal of the thematic analysis is to really identify these overarching patterns that you might be seeing in your participants' population. It's really tends to be more exploratory in nature. You might want to be collecting a little bit more wide variety of ideas when you're doing thematic analysis. And it's really good for traditional open-ended questions. But you might have, your data might be more broad, and you're trying to maybe collect more insight into the phenomenon that you're studying, okay? And the analytic process can be inductive or deductive or a combined approach. And usually this involves doing a multi-step process of coding, multiple rounds of coding potentially, and then multiple rounds of thematic analysis development before you reach your final product. This requires reading the text. Yeah? Okay. For the content analysis, it's a way to systematically categorize your data, and you're really doing frequency counts of when these ideas and things come up, right? It's the easiest thing to do for situations where there's a finite type of responses, a finite way of data collection, such as surveys. Right? Surveys are fantastic to do content analysis on because you have a numerator and a denominator. And you know how many people said X and Y because everyone was asked the same question, okay? It's ideal for a large number of responses. If you have 1,000 responses, doing a thematic analysis on 1,000 responses might be really challenging and time intensive. You might want to start your process doing a content analysis and see how certain ideas map out in terms of frequency of presence or absence. And then in the analytic process, you basically follow a set of rules to develop the code book. You might have a controlled coding process, and your words and categories might be predefined, predetermined before you start the official coding process itself. This also requires reading text, all right? I have had questions where, oh, how can I program a way to collect everything when something, house comes up, for example. Well, you can do that, but you're going to miss every time someone says home, apartment, living situation, et cetera, et cetera. Both of these require you as the interpreter of the participants' words to classify what they're saying. All right. So when we're thinking about your data, this is what it might look like, right? When I said, I shoved some papers into a filing cabinet, it didn't look too dissimilar from this, right? We might have loads and loads of data that are just pile up and we don't know what to do with them sometimes, and it might feel like this, right? So the question is where to begin, okay? And so what we need to do, and you've got the benefit of in terms of the survey analysis, is a lot of the steps have actually been done for you, okay? When we're doing interviews and focus groups, often we have to transcribe or translate the data, put them in, clean them, and put them in digitally into some sort of software, because sometimes it's easier to analyze the data through a software program. And then when we go through that, we have to think about who our team is. And this does include survey responses, and everything is there digitally. We have to think about who's part of our analytic team and who will be part of the coding process, the analytic process beyond that in terms of the interpretation, and who's a part of the dissemination team as well. Those are always good conversations to have. And it's good to think about what each person on your team brings to the team in terms of content expertise, methodological expertise, or even somebody who's not as familiar with the research question or the research aim particularly, they might actually interpret some of the same things that you're seeing differently because their motivations are different from yours. So it's nice to think about who to include in that process. And then you need to develop this analysis plan and timeline. Timeline's important for completion of the analysis itself. Who's felt this way before? Dr. Williams. Yeah. Are you feeling this way now? No, you're analyzing your data. You got mounds of data. So if you're having a hard time imagining what this process is like, we're going to go through that sort of step by step, so to give you a little better sense of how you might do that, either in the thematic analysis way or the content analysis way, okay? So the goal is moving your data from either transcripts or survey responses, and you might have a ton of survey responses, and what you want to move the data from is looking at it from the individual, and you want to see the patterns of the whole, right? So you're moving from the particular to the general, and you're moving from the real words that you're seeing to potentially more abstract things or relationships or processes, seeing the big picture. It's hard to see that sometimes when we're reading individual comments and statements, and the goal is to be able to see that across the board in your entire research pool, okay? So when we're looking at content and thematic analysis, we start the same way, okay? We have a code book. Now, your code book might be developed differently depending on your inductive or deductive approach, and you might have different types of iterations depending on your content or thematic analysis, but you're still coding, right? Somebody is still looking at the data, attaching some value and meaning to it through a code, and moving on to the next statement, moving on to the next statement, okay? So we still develop a code book, and we still use these codes as ideas, and we attach those to them, okay? And these codes are these labels, right? So who has coded before in the past? So what are some codes that you've used in the past? So just some names of codes. Adam. Technology tools, right? Because you wanted to properly categorize all the different ways that technology has been used in education. I'm making it up, right? Yeah. Anybody else who's coded? What's a code word that someone's used? Feedback, right? Types of feedback. These code words are like what I'm saying when everyone has used codes here, they're concrete words. They'll have definitions attached to them. Like we might say what feedback is or isn't. Like when is it feedback, when is it something else, right? We might, have examples of it for each of these codes. They might have definitions and examples on what we're trying to capture by this, okay? And they're really ways to prompt or trigger some sort of reflection in you at a later stage when you're looking at these groupings of ideas that are labeled under the codes to give you a better sense of what everyone is saying, okay? And then for content analysis, we could use these codes. We can start even using these codes as your frequency counts, right? Like you might even have a subcategory of technological tools, like laptops and phones, right? Or rethinking software.
Yeah, pull everywhere or ways of doing it.
Yeah, so you might end up saying, yeah, so you might say, I know that I want to have in my report something where I count how many times somebody says X, Y, Z. So these codes initially can also become your final data with the frequency counts and a content analysis, right? Okay. So if we're looking at theme analysis, what do we do next after the coding process? You start looking at these codes together in a grouped way because you're starting to see patterns, again, across your data set, not just in the individual level. And these tend to get put into things like buckets, like my colleague Janine calls them buckets, and I wish I had a picture of a bucket here, where, and these buckets end up being your overarching themes that describe the pattern, bless you, or the phenomenon of interest that you're researching, okay? So you're moving from the very real code, you're applying an idea to a meaningful unit in your text to this sort of like example or thematic statement that could be short words or phrases or a sentence that describes what they're seeing in the population. Okay? And then these themes tend to be sort of these bigger ideas, larger ideas that you end up synthesizing, you as a researcher using your brain and using that to make meaning out of your data set. Okay? And the end result of this is a theme. Okay? So what you do is you're sorting, okay, these piles. Before we had this like messy thing, right? You end up sorting these ideas and words into piles to have some sort of ordered meaning from them. So you might have, these piles are codes 1 through 6. You might say to yourself, I really think these three piles really hang together. They interrelate, or they're really sort of like definitions of a bigger picture or a bigger meaning. And so those things I'm going to maybe sort of look at together and eventually becomes theme 1. Okay? And I might say, oh, the next 2 are really, they hang together also, but they're really distinct from the first 3 and the last one. So this is my theme 2. And then, you may have guessed it, this code 6, it hangs by itself. It's a pretty big idea. And it becomes its own theme, or we say it's not part of our research question and we drop it, right? So it depends on what you want to do with that. But if we're looking at the content analysis and we're going to compare what's going on, again, we have this coding system that we talked about together. We're still going to be lumping things together usually because codes tend to be a lot more and a lot bigger than what we want to present. And these tend to be sort of these like structured categories. There might be some sort of hierarchical reframing of your code book where you develop these categories and subcategories. And your end result might be something like frequency tables, matrices. You might have a list of the codes. You might do group comparisons and frequency counts depending on the number of participants that you have and responses. You could do some fun stuff, right? You can quantify your qualitative data in this sort of ordered mechanistic way. Yeah. Yeah. So there could be, so the comment here was resources, right? So I could have a list of resources that are my codes. I could say something like resources that I have in the hospital. So I have nurses, I have like personnel resources, I have systems resources, and I have like materials resources, right? And if somebody is saying that those are the resources available to me, and I'm going through, I can count how many times people say that, and that would be a content analysis. Okay, so I could still have a thematic analysis that's about resources. But my themes might end up being, when the materials are available, my personnel resources are more efficient and effective, right? Because that might be what people end up saying in their conversations about something, right? So the two types of analyses can give you, I'm still getting resources as an output, but my interpretation of the term might have different value to different audiences. Like somebody might want to actually just tally, like, what are my resources available to me, right? Like maybe we just don't know. But we might also say, how are people utilizing the resources that are available to them? And that might lead us to say, well, what are resources that we're lacking? Or if one team is more efficient than another, we can, maybe look at their resources available to them and see what makes them more efficient, right? So there's different goals in mind. Does that answer your question? Okay. So through the content analysis process, these codes are then condensed like we talked about. We might re-split them up because it might be more meaningful in different ways. We could just think of that through as to sort of when that would be useful. And then usually these data are represented numerically and are quantified. So we have our same pile, right? Like we can do the same type of idea where we have, we develop things where we put things in codes, but all of a sudden I'm adding some sort of numeric value to them, right? Like I'll say that, the first code is brought up by 25% of the patient or the participants. The second code's been brought up 15% of the time, right? And this becomes my category, right? This then might be my resources category where I might say, this is how many times it's brought up. And you can think through where it makes more sense if it's a percentage by percentage by category or percentage by total number of responses, but that's up to your own research question, okay? So that's how it sort of shakes out if you look at content analysis and thematic analysis. And then the process itself, looks very similar in terms of how one would go through it, but the outcome is quite different. Okay? The thing to think about here is that, both of these have, like I said earlier, start with coding, right? We still have to code the data. We still sort the data in some way, but in theme analysis, we really develop themes. We gather data to support these ideas that we have that might explain a phenomenon that's occurring. We're iteratively searching for, reviewing, and modifying the themes to make sense for the entire group, okay? And we might want to use these themes to tell a sufficient story about a process, a relationship, the things that people are experiencing, et cetera. And then content analysis, we're looking at patterns that people might have talked about, looking at categories, lists of things. We're showing frequencies and counts that we talked about. And it might be a more systematic way to sort of slice and dice your data if you've got a lot of data. And it's also a good way to start your research process, okay? So one might think, hey, I can start with content analysis. I'm looking at the frequencies of these 1,000 responses, and that might give me a sense on what I want to do a deeper dive on, okay? And then you might want to look at a deeper dive on even just the categories that are most interesting to you or the most frequent or most infrequent, depending on your research question, okay? But either way, you're going to be presenting your final findings, right, as some sort of data table or narrative where you're going to be having to defend which approach that you ended up taking, right? But also how you explored alternative explanations, and you're going to be presenting the findings as either themes or categories and get feedback on that, right? Through some sort of process, either through a report or a presentation or a manuscript. Both of these end up reporting relevant themes or categories. Theme analysis ends up being narrative quotes and summaries. And I like to do tables because, I don't know, for those of us who are publishing in medical journals, you save space, okay? So I mean, at the very end of the day, it's nice to have quotes embedded in text. It reads great. It really brings home the point. but sometimes you just have 800 words to say something. And 100 of them cannot be your participant if you can have a table. I also love thematic diagrams. I like to show how things might relate to each other, or if there might be some sort of like process, like one thing leads to another thing, or how these three things are related to this like bigger idea. So you can be creative in how you present your themes. Just because you have a theme that might be a sentence doesn't mean you can't get creative with other ways and how you can show how that is impactful for your participants. And then for content analysis, this tends to be on the more descriptive statistic side in terms of you might have frequencies, you might even want to compare by groups. First year medical students feel this way, fourth year medical students feel this way, right? That might give meaning to your research question. We talked about matrices, conceptual maps, et cetera, and visual models. Okay. So these are just some things, I think this is also on your handout, that when you're starting your data collection, but also when you're starting your analytic process, you might want to think about some of these things in advance so that you have a set plan for yourself, so that it's something that you can follow, but also so that you know what to do if some problems occur along the way, like hurdles come up, okay? So you want to think about how do you want to handle the data. Some people like to print out their data into large stacks and do manual sortings, right? This is one of their original ways that anthropologists studied qualitative data. Is they would print out a bunch of their interviews or field notes in like 30 different times, and they would cut out literally the sections and put them into a literal pile, right? So you can imagine their offices were piles and piles of paper, right? And that's a really like good kinesthetic way of seeing what you're seeing the data. But it might not be your style, right? So to think through that process as well. It's not my style, but it's kind of a neat like way to think about it. People like to print out their data and maybe leave some space on one side or the other and jot down sort of the ideas that they're having. These might be the starts of your codes, right? You might be reading, a sentence or participant's response, and you might sort of have an idea. Resources. You might end up being more specific the more you read, but this is how you're starting the code development process. We also have software that's available to us. We can use something like Excel or Word, but we also have software that's specific to qualitative research as well. NVivo is software that's free through Stanford. You have to go through the Stanford libraries to procure it. I use Deduce, which is a monthly software program, and I'll show you later what that looks like in terms of a dashboard. Like I said earlier, think about who you want to bring in for your analytic processes and be strategic on who you involve, how, and when. Bless you. The chair of the department doesn't need to be involved in the coding process potentially, right? So think about like how you might want to involve the person. It might be really useful in interpreting your data, however, or framing it in a way that's meaningful to what's important to them. Okay? And then really think through, is your study really a grounded theory? This is a question I get a lot. If it is, then yeah, then definitely it is, right? But think through, like, if you're going to be doing a grounded theory study, is it this iterative data collection analytic process that shapes and changes over the course of your entire work? And if it does, then you're doing a grounded theory project, and it's one of the 5 different ways to do qualitative data, and it's a wonderful technique to incorporate. Okay, so you might say to yourself, I haven't seen any qualitative research published in medical education. Who hasn't seen medical education qualitative research published? All right, people have seen it, great. I can skip this section? No. So these are some examples on how it would be presented, okay? So these are all medical education-based studies. They're not as recent, but some were conducted here at Stanford, so it's pretty interesting. So on the left-hand side is a thematic analysis example, and the research question is, what are clerkship students' experiences with a narrative exercise to help them with interviewing patients, or practice the interviewing patient skill technique, and this was done through a psychiatry clerkship. So they had 44 students complete over 300 responses. This was survey-based. And it was coded using an inductive data-driven approach, and it was iteratively developed over time. And the findings itself are these themes, which I'll show you examples of how they put it into the text. And the themes showed how the students felt the exercise helped with their communication skills training, basically. And they also developed a conceptual framework. Now, the study on the right in purple was done by one of our students, and the question that she had was similar. What did clerkship students perceive are communication challenges in the outpatient setting? Right, so this is done in family medicine. When students complete the family medicine clerkship at the time, they talked about their challenges, and this was sort of their exit survey. So we had a large number of students who completed a large number of open survey questions, right? So it made a little more sense for her to do a content analysis approach because there were just so many responses. And a lot of these, surprisingly, were actually multiple paragraph responses on sort of these challenging encounters they had. I was surprised at how much data we had overall. What was really interesting about this study is that we ended up using a communication framework to start the coding process itself. So it was a deductive approach, and we had additional codes added to it to help describe additional things that we were seeing in the data. Okay, and her results ended up being these categories. So she quantified, 68% were these intrapersonal dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll go into what that looks like as well, right? So it's sort of the similar research questions, similar data collection processes, and these are just different ways that they're presenting the findings. So this is the example from the thematic analysis. These are actually quotes embedded in the text. I think this was an academic medicine article, so they had 3,000 words to work with, which is fantastic. So what the researcher did was they synthesized the findings by theme. So you would present it theme by theme by theme. These seem to be like bigger ideas, so communication and insight and hope. And then they described how the data related to the theme. So they talked about, they brought in specific examples. They described the theme before the examples were brought up in the text. They also developed this conceptual model from the data as well. Now, this is sort of going a step beyond just analyzing the data from a thematic analysis standpoint, but looking at the relationships on how things might happen. So the idea being that active listening really enhanced the communication, which really brought a lot of insights, personal insights to the students themselves and gave them hope in terms of their future interactions with this very specific patient group. Okay, so it's kind of cool, right? So you might not think in advance that this is something that you too can develop, but it is something that as you're going through the analytic process, you might say to yourself, something bigger is happening here. How can I visualize this or show this to others and have that be part of my findings? And then this is the content analysis table here. So this was Jenna's study, like I said, and then really went into each code, what the definition was, the frequency of the presentation, and an example quote from it. Okay, so we all have handouts in front of us where you, one of the pages is sort of like a matrix of quotes, excuse me. And we probably don't have time to practice. Is it 5:15 or 6:15 or 6:30? 6:30? Well, let's do a little bit, okay? So let's have this group here do the thematic analysis. So your job is to look at the side that says thematic analysis and to sort of like, sorry, we're doing a coding exercise. You're going to be basically reading each quote and sort of like writing a word or a phrase next to the quote about some ideas that you might come up with about what that quote is. And then this side here, you're going to do, bless you, you're going to do the deductive exercise, and you've been given a code above it, and just check off, where you think that code applies or not to that that quote. I don't know. You have what you have. And both of you have the same quotes. Both sets of you have the same quotes in the same order and everything. So don't cheat. Don't look at the back.
Is there only one thing for each statement?
No. There's not, that question was, is there only one code for each statement? No. There can be multiple codes. Good question. So we're just going to do one more minute just for the sake of time. All right, so before we lose everybody, let's have one person from each side describe their, like what they said about the first quote. So this side here, our inductive side, where we are basically reading a sentence and thinking up of a code name. Yeah, go ahead.
I said connections to a learning trajectory.
Connections to learning trajectory. What's your second one? Yeah.
Specificity.
Specificity. All right. So do other people have that sort of comment for each of those? Or did you have something different? You had examples? Uh-huh. Give examples, okay. So that's specificity, it's pretty specific, right? What else did you see? Well, or I thought you raised your hand, sorry. No, okay.
For the first one, just feedback.
Yeah, feedback asked for multiple times, okay. How was this process for you? You kind of were given, you can do whatever you wanted. You could put whatever statement down next to it, kind of open-ended. You kind of had a loose research question at the top. Was it hard? Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to sort of like decide, right? Like that this is what this is, right? This is why coding can be iterative. You might sort of change your mind about what a definition is. How about our group over here where we're given one-word codes? What was the first quote? You have specific and meaningful. What did you have? Meaningful, so not specific. Meaningful, okay. Meaningful, okay. So we're given a set finite code, 4 codes here, and we're not in total agreement as to what the quote was, right? Right, so that's kind of interesting.
What's interesting is it wasn't until I went down and I decided what I wanted a code for things that I went back and said, yeah, that sounds a little different. I'll give it a different code.
Yeah, right. So that you had to go through and see multiple examples to see if it actually is the thing that you think it is, right? So definitions are really important, okay? This is a hard task. Both of these are really hard to do because we don't know here what we're actually coding for. We're just sort of like out there. Over here, we have a finite number of things we code for, but we're not really clear on what the full definition is because it might change. And both of these times it might change, right? So coding is hard to do. It's hard to do systematically. It's hard to do between people systematically, right? So that's sort of an important lesson usually from this exercise, all right? I'm going to briefly go over qualitative software because we don't have too much time. We have this in your handouts, but basically they don't do the coding for you. You still code, but it's a way to present your data in a way that could be meaningful to you and others. These are some different ways that you can do it, the analysis process, and I used Deduce, and this is sort of what a dashboard looks like, okay? And then before we all leave, wanted to do a little promo for a mixed methods workshop that we're presenting. My group has put together a 3-day mixed methods workshop in March. Feel free to sign up if you're interested or talk to me. thank you for your time. Thank you for the room change. I know it was really, really challenging. I wanted to say that a couple announcements. We have a Slack group. Okay, who's seen the Slack group email? Yeah. So it's time to sign up for a Slack if you want to know all about the CTSS news, right? I imagine news was being shared and.
This is a discussion here to talk about your project. Start up the attention.
Great.
And the videos are also in these videos are also in Canvas, so you should have access to a Canvas shelf to watch the various videos.
Yeah, and don't forget to come next month when we're going to have a fun discussion about quantitative data analysis, right? Go from qualitative to quantitative, and enjoy. And thank you so much for all the interaction and moving the rooms.